Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dale Stevens. I'm the founder of UnCollege.org, and I want to talk today about the end of the freshman year. I want to start out by asking a couple of questions for context to better understand the audience and your own persuasions when it comes to higher ed, and hopefully our presentation comes back real fast. I'll talk a little bit about the program that we've built and how we're working with colleges and universities to reinvent what the freshman year experience can be like. Talk about some of the data that is leading students to make different kinds of decisions about higher ed than their parents did, and finish up by talking about why it's imperative that everyone get on board with what I think the future of higher ed looks like. So a couple questions for context. How many folks here graduated from a four-year institution by show of hands? Okay, most of the room. How many of you entered college with a clear idea of what you wanted to do when you grew up? A couple of hands. How many of you actually majored in that? Okay, 5 or 6 hands. And how many of you are employed in the same field that you graduated in? Okay, the same 5 or 6. I ask these questions for context because I think it's really interesting. And I can ask these questions in high schools, at conferences, all over the place. And the results tend to be reasonably similar. There are very few people who knew exactly what they wanted to do when they grew up and followed the exact same linear path through college. And yet, ostensibly, we say that college is the place that you go to figure out who you are and what you want to do. We don't actually provide the support services to really help students make those kinds of choices as they're going through college. I've been doing this work around the future of higher education for about 5 years, and the tenor of the conversation has really changed. 5 years ago, I was the crazy kid in the room who everyone brought in because I thought I was way on the left field as to where the future of higher ed was going. And that has completely changed today. We're talking with colleges and universities about working with them and inventing what the freshman year can look like. So I think it's really interesting to see how much that conversation has changed. And I think it's really because there's some really hard facts that are leading students to make different decisions about how they learn than when their parents went to school. And there are 5 things that I think are really important to understand about this. Number 1 is obviously the cost. When my dad went to college, he entered freshman year at University of California, Davis in the mid-70s. Tuition was $120 a semester. If you were to go to the same school today, you'd pay about $14,000 a year in tuition and fees alone, not to mention the cost of room and board on top of that. But I think what that means is that the calculus for someone going to college is very, very different. Students are much more focused on outcomes and retention. And they, parents saved for college, but they didn't save for an extra year or 2 for their kid to dawdle around. Parents really want to make sure that when they go, they're getting in and out on the same basis. Number 2 is that the outcomes just really aren't there. The Brookings Institution did some great research looking at the data of outcomes of students who comparing wage outcomes and increases 10 years down the line at schools that received federally funded financial aid. And at a whole quarter of schools, half of the students showed no earning gains 10 years down the line. And it was a wide swath of schools, right? It's flagship public institutions to private institutions. And so people are really concerned that when they're entering college, they want to make sure that they're making the right kind of investment. Number 3 is that there's a ton of unemployed youth around the world. And most importantly, half of those youth feel like their experience in higher ed didn't have a meaningful impact on their outcomes. Again, back to when my dad went to college, going to college in the 1970s was more or less a guarantee of a good job. That was how you went and pursued a path to get ahead. And that guarantee is not the same today. Number 4 is that the cost is real. Students are graduating with more and more debt than ever before. And I think the point that I really want to drive home here is not just that the cost is increasing, but all of the outcomes that we talk about and the benefits that you get from getting a degree are only true if you graduate. And yet, the completion rate is only about 42% nationally, right? So I think there's all of these questions, and I think it's really important to think about what's going on. how do we help students get an affordable and accessible education that's tailored to their experience and helps them really chart a path that is meaningful to them and is delivered in a way that helps them find the right path through college. There are a couple of things that are going on here that I think have really changed the dynamics of how college and curriculum is delivered. The first is that the economy and the skills that are needed are changing way faster than curriculum can. We've seen this with the rise of things like coding boot camps and so on and so forth, that there are completely new industries coming up to provide a need that isn't being filled in another way whatsoever. Guidance in colleges is frequently little more than plugging and matching courses into a graduation framework. Infrequently do guidance counselors sit down and ask students, who are you and what do you want to do? How do you learn? And how can we really work with you to reverse engineer that path and not just make sure that you graduate with an English major or history major or whatever it is that you declare that you want to do when you come in on time. Missed. I think that the crux of this is that Harris did a great study, and they found that 60% of students who are graduating from high school feel that they're not socially or emotionally ready for university. I think colleges do an excellent job of helping young people understand, learn specific content, but they don't do a very good job of helping students understand who they are and how they learn and how to make the most of that experience. So the question that we ask ourselves at UnCollege is, how do we help young people get an affordable and a meaningful education? And that's why we do the work that we do. Over the course of the last 5 years, I started asking myself, why is college in the US 4 years when in many other leading markets around the world it's only 3? The concept of being pre-law or pre-med is something that exists pretty much only in the US. If you were to go and want to become a lawyer or a doctor in Europe, you would simply go straight into those schools. And I started wondering, why is that the case? What if we knocked a year off of the 4-year system and created a year-long experience that was experiential and self-directed and helped young people gain the self-awareness to make sure that they could make the most of their college experience. Around the world, other countries do this, right? It's called national service. And if you look at those countries, they have outsized economies for the size of their country. We do this later in college, right? We call it study abroad. But frequently by the time junior year rolls around, it's too late, you're too far into your major to change. If you were going to change, you'd have to take on a year or two and incur even more debt. And in looking at models around the world, it became very clear that across Europe and Asia, gap years are incredibly common. The idea that you should take time to understand who you are and how you learn before you go to college to make that investment a better decision seemed like the obvious choice. In the UK, about 25% of students take gap years. And there's really hard research that shows that students who take gap years graduate more quickly, they have higher job satisfaction, they have higher GPAs. And it's simply because you're taking the time to be more socially and emotionally mature. So that when you get to college, you know how to make the most of that experience and really accelerate your career. You don't have to take my word for it on this. I want to share quickly the story of one of our students and then tell you a little bit more about why we do what we do. We had a student who came to us from a small town in Pennsylvania. She didn't get into her top choice colleges. And she came to us because she wanted to take the time to better understand herself, increase her skills. And after doing our program, ended up attending Temple University on a full ride studying environmental science. And I think it's stories like this that make me think that, wouldn't it be amazing if every student had the opportunity to really take the time to understand themselves and how they interact with the world, what their values are, what their identity is, so they could make better choices about where they go to college without being thrown into a system with little to no support. So our mission at UnCollege is to really help people chart a path through education. Right now, we do that by helping most of our students go on to college afterwards. and make the most of that experience. But we envision a future where there are many more choices for students, and students are able to pick and choose and put together different experiences to chart their own path throughout higher education. UnCollege has been around for 5 years, and I actually got my start in education technology when I worked at Zinch 6 years ago. That's me there on the left. I was an 18-year-old who was just finishing my college applications, and I emailed the team and said, hey, I've just gone through this process. I bet I could give you some great user feedback. And that was a really amazing introduction to being part of education technology. But the reason I tell you this is that the reason I was able to do that as an 18-year-old was because I had parents who allowed me to do something called unschooling, which is a self-directed form of homeschooling. And although my parents spent many sleepless nights wondering how I would fare outside of school, eventually they said, hey, it's your life. You've got to make your own choices. And allowed me to embrace a kind of education that had a philosophy and a framework for what I was trying to describe. Unschooling wasn't solitary. There was very much a community of people who were doing it, but at the heart of it was this idea of self-direction and that the student should drive the learning process. And that experience allowed me to do things that I never would have been able to do had I been in a traditional high school, and has really informed how I've built UnCollege as an organization. I ended up writing a book called Hacking Your Education that Penguin published in 2013. And one of the things that became really clear throughout the book writing process was that everyone that I interviewed had become very good at learning how to learn. And I started wondering, why weren't those skills things that we taught in college or in high school? We could very explicitly teach how to negotiate and communicate and keep yourself motivated and advocate for yourself and build relationships with mentors. These are all incredibly key skills that we as adults practice every day. Yet no one ever sat down and taught you those things. And so that was the key question that I started asking when we started to build the Gap Year program that we run today. I think what's really interesting about what we do is that this Gap Year program has become a combination of personal growth and professional development. Traditionally, Gap Year has been a thing that students do where you go and run around Thailand for a year, but don't do very much actually rigorous learning. And we think that there's absolutely value in going off and having new experiences and putting yourself in a new culture, and that's a piece of the program. But we think that there's an equal amount of value in having rigorous learning, building a coaching model, teaching curriculum, and setting up students with a real-world experience, an internship, which are the 3 phases that cap out the year. When we first started this, we made a whole bunch of assumptions that were absolutely incorrect. I was a Teal Fellow the very first year, and when we started building this Gap Year program, we thought it was going to be a full-fledged alternative to college for people who wanted to do something entirely different. And that was absolutely wrong. It turned out that there are very few people who are capable of short-circuiting the system entirely, and that for the vast majority of people who are capable of doing that, they don't really need a program. They're capable of doing it on their own. And what became clear was that there was a high need for a program that helped young people make better decisions about who they are and what they wanted to learn. And that's what our Gap Year program has become. The backbone of the program is a coaching model. Every student has a coach that works with them one-on-one throughout the entire year. And they're there to ask the questions that an academic advisor never does. They're there to support our students both individually and personally and professionally. But fundamentally, they're there to ask the questions that you don't know. When you're 18, there's lots of things that you don't know about the world. And one of the values of being part of an educational program is that you have someone who's there to point out the unknown unknowns. Across the program, we've built in self-directed learning philosophy at every level. We want our students to be comfortable making mistakes, knowing how to add personal context to what they do, being comfortable taking breaks, and knowing that having a growth mindset is going to really accelerate what they do. we have a really strong bias against having people, quote unquote, pursue their passions. We think there's a really big problem with telling millennials that they can do what they're passionate about, because you end up in a situation where someone's identity is so tied to their work that sometimes if you can't get a job doing the thing that you've decided that defines you, you can cause a massive crisis without even, before someone is even 25. So the questions that we like to ask our students are, what is the intersection of things that you're good at and things that make you money? And how is that intersection poised to find you a job that can help you support yourself in a meaningful and fulfilling way? It's clear that the gap years are growing all across the states. Harvard and Princeton and Yale now recommend that all their students take gap years, and the reason is simple, right? Colleges and universities know that students who take gap years and take that time have a much better understanding of who they are. They're the kind of students that universities want, and they're more likely to create the outcomes that will make universities proud. In the last 5 years, it's clear that education has changed a ton. We've seen colleges shut down, we've seen new industries be created, and I think the reason why it's imperative that higher ed embrace the changes that we see is not just for the financial health and fiscal health of institutions, but because it really does increase student outcomes across the board. Gallup did a really great study midway through last year, and they found that students who had these 6 things in their college experience, someone who made them excited about learning, personal connections to professors, mentors who helped them on their goals and dreams, experience working on a long-term project, real-world experience through a job or internship, and getting involved in extracurricular activities, were far more likely to graduate within 4 years, be engaged at work, and thrive at well-being, and be prepared for life. The more experiences students had, the more likely they were to excel at all of these things. And the reason I mentioned that, we looked at the study and said, geez, they could have written this for us. Those 6 things are really at the core of our program, and they're really what helps students accelerate. And anecdotally, we had seen these things really help our students, and we said, wow, look, these are the things that really accelerate the growth and development of young people. I think what's interesting to think about is the comparison of what we're doing in our industry to where coding boot camps have come just in the last couple of years. You have to recall that while coding boot camps are a dime a dozen these days, just 4 or 5 years ago they didn't exist at all. And we think the gap year market is very similar and is poised for a similar amount of growth and explosion. We think that we should let colleges do what they do best. Colleges are really good at teaching specific content, but they're not particularly good at the discovery process. And we think that the combination of a gap year with content teaching becomes a really powerful learning facility for students. We were interviewing a program director for a position last week, and he said, what's really interesting about what you do is that you've gone from being UnCollege to UnCollege. And that's really true. A lot of what we're doing right now is finding ways to work with colleges and universities to help them manage their enrollment and facilities and all those kinds of things. We've also been hard at work building the program to make it work more within the system and to make parents and students feel like they're making a choice that will accelerate their path within higher education and that they're not making a left turn outside of it. And what I'm super excited to announce today is that just last week we were approved for college credit by CSU Global, and students this fall will be able to get credit for the program for the first time. as we go forward, there's many more things that we can do. We think that there's many more ways to work with colleges and universities. And I think what's really exciting is that parents tell us, wow, I wish this program had been around when I was 18. I didn't know what I wanted to do. We hear from counselors at high schools that they think a third of their students should do something like this to take the time to understand who they are and how they learn before they go to college. And we think that that's so important, and the reason that we do the work that we do every day is because we want to create a world where we have lifelong learners who are empowered to make changes in their own lives and in the world around them. Thank you.